Okay, so welcome along, ladies and gentlemen, to your weekly SETI seminar series. Today we're very lucky to be joined by Steve Warren, who's come down to us from University of Washington. Steve did an AB in chemistry at Cornell, and then did his PhD at Harvard in chemistry. The topic of his PhD structure was the crystal structure of aspartate transcarbamylase. After that, he's moved into University of Washington, where he spent the last 31 years. He's a professor of atmospheric sciences there. Steve is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Meteorological Society. He has a location in Antarctica called Warren Ridge, named after him, and his career interests have focused on ice and snow and optical constants of water ice, for example, ocean surfaces covered with snow, soot in Antarctic snow, and global cloud climatology and the effects of soot on climate change that's currently ongoing. Today we're going to hear about his recent trip to Antarctica and the results of research that he's published recently in JGR on ocean surfaces of Snowball Earth. So please join me in welcoming Steve.
Oh, thanks, Adrian, for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. One thing that Adrian left out of the introduction was my training in chemistry and in molecular biology, there was a transition to get into atmospheric physics. It took 4 years of hard work as a postdoc, mostly in Boulder, Colorado. But I'm going to talk about Snowball Earth. Well, should we turn the lights down a little bit, maybe? Yeah, what we mean by Snowball Earth is the ocean freezing all the way to the equator. So if the ocean freezes, you've got sea ice, and then snow falls on the sea ice, and the Earth is covered with snow. And so from a distance, it looks like a snowball. I would like to present the idea of Snowball Earth in 5 steps: an observation, a theory, a hypothesis, a puzzle, and a coincidence. First, with the observation, is of glacial deposits at sea level within 10 degrees of the paleoequator in Neoproterozoic time, meaning about 700 million years ago. And there were probably 2 events that were totally, where the ocean was totally ice covered, and maybe another one where it didn't quite get that far. And these glaciations were apparently long lasting, and one piece of evidence for that is there are 7 magnetic reversals in one of these glacial deposits, the Alatina Formation in South Australia. So okay, let's do the time scale here from the, maybe I can do this. Yeah, right. From Neoproterozoic, that is the end of the Precambrian period. Precambrian divided up into the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic meaning microscopic life, and Phanerozoic meaning macroscopic life. And there's the beginning of the Proterozoic, the Paleoproterozoic, and the Neoproterozoic. Both of those times were periods of apparently Snowball Earth events, maybe 3 of them in the Paleoproterozoic. Oh, I better not do this. This is, maybe, okay, I guess I'll choose, well, you're on both sides. I guess I'll choose this one. Here's time going the other direction to the present, so time going from right to left, showing several things here. The extent of glaciation is by the length of these blue bars. So these were the snowball events. And then there was a period of more than a billion years where there's apparently no evidence for glaciation at all. And these 2 periods of time with the snowball events occurred at the times of the rise of oxygen. The first rise of oxygen up to a few percent, and then the second rise of oxygen up to 20%. There's probably some significance to that coincidence. What's also shown here are some other things, the banded iron formations, evidence of an anoxic ocean, and then the ocean became oxygenated, but then these banded iron formations appear again, indicating that maybe the ocean was sealed off another piece of evidence, or consistent with Snowball Earth events. And then these other blue lines are more recent ice ages and the current Pleistocene glaciation that we're in now, with part of the Earth glaciated. So the evidence was presented by Brian Harland, 1964, in which he identified locations where there was evidence for glaciation at about this time, about 700 million years ago, what he called the Varangian Age. And some of them, they were on all continents, and some of them appeared to be at low latitude. And the evidence for that was in the magnetic inclination. So for example, here, this is a drop stone, and for a stone like this to appear in the sediments in the middle of the ocean, the only way it could get there is by being transported in an iceberg. And then if you look above and below at find some magnetic materials and look at the magnetic inclination, to work out the paleolatitude. And some of these were very close to the equator. Now we have more data and better data. This is a review article by David Evans showing locations of possible Neoproterozoic deposits, glacial deposits. And I've surrounded one of these by a red box indicating a very important one, which is the Latina Formation in South Australia. That is very, and he judged the reliability of the paleolatitude determination, and judged that one to be very reliable. So within 10 degrees of the paleoequator. The theory is about albedo. Albedo is the ratio of upward solar radiation to the downward solar radiation, so the fraction that's reflected. And it varies from the darkest material, which is ocean water, reflects 7% of the sunlight, and snow is the brightest material, about 80%, and the planet as a whole now reflects about 30%, which is mostly due to clouds. Well, the theory is that there's a positive feedback, an amplifying feedback of snow albedo that does result in instability in many climate models. So snow has the highest albedo, but other forms of ice also have fairly high albedos. Glacier ice and not as high as snow, but still quite a bit higher than ocean water. So if you cool the climate and you form snow, or you get sea ice, think it's covered with snow, then it reflects sunlight, so it cools the climate even further. So it's a positive feedback. So on the left is representing the small ice caps. You've got the ice on the poles, and you cool the climate, the ice line will move equatorward, and then you warm the climate, it'll move back, and it's reversible and stable. But if the ice line does advance to within about 20 or 30 degrees from the equator, there's no stopping it. It jumps to the equator. So that's the diagram on the right. And the reason for that, I think, before saying the reason for that, just to point out that if you do cover the Earth with ice and you keep the solar constant the same as it is today, it would be stable. The temperature, because of reflecting so much sunlight, the temperature at the equator would be well below freezing. So it's an alternative stable state for the Earth. It's not the state that we're in, but if we could get there, it would be stable. Why there's this instability that leads to this catastrophe, there's actually two of them, both at high latitude and low latitude. So this diagram shows the distribution of solar radiation, the annual average, as a function of latitude. So it's high at the equator and low at the pole. This is specific for a tilt of 23.5 degrees, which is what the Earth has. And you see that it's fairly weak dependence on latitude at low latitude and at high latitude, but a steep dependence in middle latitude. So there's actually both the small ice cap instability and the large ice cap instability, and it might be easiest to start with the small ice cap instability. If you start out with a planet with no ice and you cool the climate so that ice just forms at the pole, say at the North Pole. And so here's the temperature as a function of latitude. In order to get ice to persist through the summer at the North Pole, then maybe you'd have to have an annual temperature, average temperature, about -10. So let's say we have no ice, and then the temperature is just above -10, and it increases with latitude, and it gets more steep as you get into the mid-latitude. And now we cool the climate so it drops below -10, so now you have ice at the pole. Okay, now it's reflecting sunlight, so it goes way below -10, but it doesn't keep it to itself because there's atmospheric circulation that will export some of that cold to the next latitude zone and cool it down below the freezing temperature, and so it will expand. And what stops it is this when this becomes steep, and that's because the solar radiation is in the mid-latitudes is a steep function of latitude. So there's the minimum size for an Arctic ice cap. Actually, we may be seeing this going on right now as the Arctic sea ice drops below this minimum size. But then you also have the large ice cap instability, where if the ice gets too close to the equator, then it just feeds on itself and jumps to the equator. And that was pointed out first by Budico, actually simultaneously by Bill Sellers at Arizona, but both in the same year in different journals, 1969. And he just reduced the solar constant successively, and he saw that this happened. But climate modelers, and I was one of them, intrigued by this paper, were not familiar with the geological evidence, and the geologists were not familiar with the climate modeling. And so it was not until 1992 that the connection was made between the geological evidence and the climate modeling by Joe Kirschvink, who's a professor at Caltech. And he coined the term Snowball Earth. He suggested that, well, maybe this actually happened. One of the reasons we thought it had not happened, and it was just a curiosity of the models, was we didn't see any way out. So we thought that if it had happened, we'd still be glaciated. And he coined the term Snowball Earth. And so his hypothesis was that this runaway albedo feedback catastrophe actually occurred during the Neoproterozoic. Each event would have lasted maybe 10 million years, some millions of years anyway, and what ended it, there is a way out, the greenhouse effect due to buildup of carbon dioxide. So the idea is that on a snowball planet, so cold there's no rain, there's no rock weathering, there's no way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you sort of interrupt the carbon cycle, the geologic carbon cycle. But volcanoes are continuing to emit carbon dioxide. So eventually you build up enough of a greenhouse that even with a high albedo, you can start melting the ice. And of course, then you start melting it, it will be at the equator. But as soon as you uncover some dark ocean, it'll just expand on itself. And you'll be way out of balance with a hot planet with no ice and a huge greenhouse effect, which then will rapidly remove the carbon dioxide suddenly at the end of this glacial event. So there's a sequence of dramatic climate changes. And so these were the most dramatic climate changes, at least in the last few billion years. And yet they weren't really understood until fairly recently, in the 90s. The evidence was greatly substantiated by Paul Hoffman, who got interested in this problem in a conversation with Joe Kirschvink. And in this paper, 1998, this is what got me first interested in pursuing it further, was they particularly looked at the carbonate deposits and looked at carbon isotopes in them. So they summarized the evidence there that is consistent with the snow, or can be explained by this hypothesis. There are glacial deposits at low paleolatitudes. These thick carbonate layers capping the glacial deposit. You have the glacial deposits, and then right on top, thick carbonate layers, which is what you would expect as the carbon dioxide suddenly came out of the atmosphere at the end of the snowball event. There are these iron deposits after a billion-year absence that indicated that the ocean had gone anoxic. And the isotopes of carbon in these cap carbonates were what you would expect without biological fractionation, indicating that they were deposited inorganically without going through a biological process of making shells, et cetera. Here's the junction between one of the glacial deposits and then this cap carbonate. The upper half of the diagram of the picture is carbonate deposit. The conditions that might have facilitated going into the Snowball Earth, the sun was dimmer, continents were small and near the equator, so there wasn't a negative feedback on the removal of carbon dioxide, and lots of shallow sea continental shelf. All of these probably predisposed the Earth, but there had to be a trigger, and there has to be an explanation why it didn't happen for a billion years before this. And this is really not understood. The cause of the snowball onset is almost certainly due to a failure of the greenhouse effect, but why carbon dioxide was dropped down to very low levels, maybe methane was involved as well. I think we understand better how we got out of it than how we got into it. So I'm not going to talk about this. It's not my area of research. Okay, now we get on to the puzzle. These snowball events, you freeze the ocean surface. It doesn't freeze all the way to the bottom of the ocean, but it freezes probably hundreds of meters. This would be traumatic for surface life, obviously. The puzzle is that there was some surface life that continued. It was not just at the bottom of the ocean at mid-ocean ridges. There was photosynthetic eukaryotic algae that survived. They were there both before and after these events, and they require both liquid water and sunlight. So the probably thing that we can count on for sure is there would be some tiny refugia at hot spots on shallow coastlines around volcanic islands. So where you have geothermal heat close enough to the ocean surface that it could melt through any ice. And that would be like today we have Hawaii and Iceland. There might have been a few of these scattered around the Earth, and for millions of years in isolation, not in competition with each other, allowing for evolution of diversity. So that's one possible consequence of having isolated refugia. And I'll talk about it later on, another possible, still fairly small refugia. And then there's the coincidence that several authors have pointed out that it's shortly after the final snowball event was the so-called Cambrian explosion, when numerous animal phyla suddenly appear as fossils, like about a dozen animal phyla all simultaneously appearing. And so there's this question which has motivated a lot of us. Was Snowball Earth responsible for the evolution of animals? Maybe without these snowball events, life would just still be happily microscopic and there wouldn't be animals. Okay, now was the ocean frozen? Okay, first, there is geological evidence for sea level glaciation within 10 degrees of the equator. Now, there is glaciation now at the equator, and it's up at 5,000 meters and above. There's in the Andes and in East African volcanoes. It comes down to 5,000 meters. But now if you want to cool the climate enough to bring those glaciers down to sea level, you have to reduce the solar constant or reduce the greenhouse effect enough. If you do that in a climate model, then what generally happens is the ocean freezes. And it's possible to prevent that, but you have to work really hard and you have to cheat in your climate model to keep the ocean at the equator not frozen and still allow glaciers on land to reach sea level. So the easiest thing from a climate modeling point of view is to say that the ocean froze. Now, most geologists do agree that glaciers did reach sea level near the equator, but they don't think the oceans froze. So that's the current status this is a controversial idea. And I think as time goes on, I think it will probably become more accepted. But whether it is accepted or not is not, or actually looking at evidence for the paleoclimate evidence or glacial evidence is not my research. My research is look at consequences. What if this did happen? What would the Earth have looked like? I want to point out, I mean, what we're familiar with for ice on Earth now, the ice ages of the Pleistocene, where we have ice on Greenland and Antarctica. And during the last 2 million years, ice sheets have advanced over large parts of North America, Scandinavia, and Siberia. For example, the North American ice sheet 20,000 years ago was about the same size that the Antarctic ice sheet is now, both in area and in volume. But we need to think differently about Snowball Earth. It's qualitatively different. Most of the action on Snowball Earth was in the ocean, not so much on land. In fact, the ice on land would have been very sluggish. You're getting precipitation rates of maybe 1 millimeter a year. So there would have been glaciers on land, but they would have been extremely sluggish compared to what's in the ocean, which I'll show you doesn't really depend on precipitation, believe it or not. A good review article, if you'd like to read about all aspects of the Snowball Earth. This came out 2 years ago by Ray Pierre Humbert, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and his co-workers. So I'll recommend that to you. And then I'll go on to my own research, which is about ocean surfaces. So this Snowball Earth is a great catchy name, but it's a little bit misleading because the ocean was not totally snow-covered. There would have been large parts of the ocean that were snow-covered, but there would also be sea ice, glacier ice, and salt-covered ice, and dust-covered ice, because there would be areas that were not snow-covered. I'll explain why that is. And at least my motivation for this research is to identify what kinds of refugia were available for surface life and which ones were unlikely. So we have a project at University of Washington, and we have, because it involves some field work, we have funding from the U.S. Antarctic Program. And my co-PIs are Bonnie Light, who's a sea ice expert, Ed Waddington, who's expert on glacier dynamics, and each of them is supervising a graduate student. Ružica Dadic came originally from Bosnia, came to us by way of Switzerland, and now is working in New Zealand. Rich Brandt was involved and as a staff scientist, and our 2 graduate students, Adam Campbell doing the, well, get to his work in a bit. Regina Carnes is working on the sea ice, artificial sea ice, and we've had a couple of undergraduates working in the lab. And then for our field work that I'll tell you about, Melanie Fitzpatrick was a former graduate student, did a PhD with me on Antarctic sea ice and clouds and solar radiation. And she's from Australia and moves around between Australia and North America and Antarctica. And right now she happens to be here in the audience by lucky chance. Peter Mullen was my first graduate student. He came back to work with us on this. He did a master's degree on explaining the albedo of lake ice by the sizes of bubbles. And Martin Schneebly from the Snow and Avalanche Center in Davos. So we'll start out with some glaciological terms. These are the ones you're probably already familiar with. And then we'll go on to some that are not so familiar. An ice sheet is continental scale glaciation on land. Ice shelf is floating glacier ice that flowed off the continent, continuous with the ice sheet. Iceberg, at the front of the ice shelf, chunks of ice break off by waves and currents, and they would be several hundred meters thick. Sea ice, so everything I've talked about, everything so far has its origin as snow. Sea ice is different. It's formed by freezing of seawater at the ocean's surface, contains brine inclusions and bubbles. Yeah, and it's only on the order of a meter thick. So, yeah, to just schematically show these, snow falls on the Antarctic ice sheet it gets compressed into ice that then flows out onto the ocean as an ice shelf. Icebergs break off, and then the sea ice is much thinner. So, for example, here we are looking at the front of the Amory ice shelf, and it's maybe 40 meters exposed above sea level, and the rest down below. See, and in the foreground is sea ice that, in this case, is only a few centimeters because it formed overnight. Then a more obscure type of ice is what we call marine ice, and that is seawater that freezes to the base of an ice shelf. It can be seen if icebergs are small enough horizontally, they break off and capsize. And it's different. It is frozen seawater, but contains no bubbles and very little brine. So it looks very different from both glacier ice and sea ice. So here's one of these composite icebergs. You can see on the left is glacier ice, and the reason it's bright is because starts out as snow. Snow contains air. Snow gets compressed into ice, so the air gets closed off as bubbles, and the bubbles scatter light. This is the boundary line. This was the bottom of the glacial ice, and then all this is frozen seawater that froze onto the base of the ice shelf. So this was originally horizontal, and then it got capsized. So I'll actually let you puzzle about why so much ice would have frozen to the base of an ice shelf, and why there are no bubbles and very little brine. The answers to some of those are known. And then finally, sea glacier does not exist in the modern Earth, but would have been dominant on the ocean on Snowball Earth, and that is a self-sustaining ice shelf that's not dependent on continental glaciation. It just grows on its own in the ocean and then gets thick enough to flow. How thick was the ice? Well, probably hundreds of meters. Why is that? On the modern Earth, we have thin ice is common on today's ocean. Why not on Snowball Earth? So in the Arctic and the Antarctic, we have ice on the order of 1 to 3 meters thick. And what keeps it thin is a heat flux from the ocean. So you have warm water that is heated by sunlight at low latitude. It flows poleward, gets under the ice, and provides a heat source under the ice. That heat has to be conducted up through the ice. And this is the heat flux equation. The heat flux is proportional to the temperature gradient, and the proportionality constant is the thermal conductivity. So if you have a larger, so the heat flux is inversely proportional to the thickness. If you specify the surface temperature from climate and the bottom temperature is the freezing temperature of seawater, then the thickness is determined. Now, how it gets to be in equilibrium, suppose you had a heat flux supplied that's greater than the heat flux that can be conducted through the ice. If the ice is too thick, then the heat flux you can conduct is going to be too small. So then you're going to have an excess that's not conducted, and that excess will be used to melt ice until it gets thin enough that you are in equilibrium. So essentially the reason you get into equilibrium is because ice is less dense than water, and it stays at the top. Okay, well, on the Snowball Ocean, what you would have after you seal off the ocean from the atmosphere and from solar radiation, you no longer have that source of heating from sunlight at low latitude. So after a few thousand years, the ocean loses its reservoir of heat, and the whole ocean is at the freezing temperature. And so all you're left with then is geothermal heat, which doesn't vary with latitude. It might be about 0.08 watts per square meter. And so that's 2 orders of magnitude weaker than what we've got now, which means the ice is going to be 2 orders of magnitude thicker, or hundreds of meters instead of meters. And it's thick enough to flow. And that was pointed out by Jason Goodman when he was a postdoc with Ray Pierre Humbert. What's going on then is, so from south to north, here's a transect, south, equator, north. Everywhere the geothermal heat's the same. Everywhere at the bottom is at the freezing temperature. Thermal conductivity of ice is the same everywhere. The only thing that's different is the surface temperature, which would be warmer at the equator, colder at high latitude. So maybe it's if it's minus 60 as opposed to minus 30, then the ice would be twice as thick in equilibrium. But that thickness gradient generates a flow. Ice will flow from thick to thin. And then it'll be too thin for equilibrium at high latitude, so you get freezing to the base. And it'll be too thick for high latitude at the equator, so you get melting at the base. So you actually have this self-sustaining circulation of melting, freezing, and flow that is a hydrological cycle within the ocean independent of the atmospheric hydrological cycle. Even if you had no atmospheric hydrological cycle, no evaporation, no precipitation, this will still go on. So that's why I say the action is in the ocean, because this can happen even with a very weak atmospheric hydrological cycle. How fast? Well, this was Jason's first paper. And for an unconfined sea glacier, it could be as much as 2 kilometers a year at the front, kind of like the Ross Ice Shelf now in Antarctica. After the northern and southern sea glaciers have merged at the equator, then it slows down, and the maximum would be about 50 meters a year, peaking at 20 degrees latitude. Now, I tried to persuade Jason when he was writing this paper to change his plot so that he plotted versus latitude. You have to subtract from 90. So 70 co-latitude means 20 degrees latitude. This is what his program used, was co-latitude. And I thought it would be easy enough to switch it, but he insisted on plotting it this way. In later papers, he did change his display to latitude. Anyway, we can think then, suppose you're out on the sea ice, suppose you are the sea ice on the equator, and here comes the northern sea glacier from one side and the southern sea glacier from the other side, and as they advance, eventually it's going to crush the sea ice to oblivion. So we expect that to happen, that sea ice would start out when the ocean first freezes catastrophically, but then over time, eventually, after a few thousand years, the sea glaciers would invade. So what was on the surface of the Snowball Ocean besides snow? Yeah, why isn't it totally snow-covered? Well, it's because there are areas with net evaporation. This is, so 2 plots of precipitation minus evaporation. So the blue is negative, where evaporation exceeds precipitation. And the top plot is for the modern Earth. And so the areas where evaporation exceeds precipitation is in the subtropical oceans. On the Snowball Earth, well, this is from one, this is Pollard and Casting. This is from one possible reconstruction of where the continents were 750 million years ago. And the scale is down by a factor of 30 because of the reduced hydrological cycle. But you still have areas that are blue. Almost half the ocean in low latitude has evaporation, or actually sublimation, exceeding precipitation. So you'd have areas of bare ice. Bare ice and different types of bare ice, and we need to know what they were, and we need to know what their albedos are, because, well, you probably have heard that in climate modeling for the global warming problem, for future climate change, the biggest source of uncertainty is cloud feedback. But in the snowball problem, by contrast, the biggest source of uncertainty is surface albedo. And why is that? Well, surface albedo and snow and ice albedo is important for the modern climate. But snow and ice are at high latitude, except in the winter, mid-latitude in the winter, and so they don't get exposed to much sunlight. But if you can bring snow and ice down to low latitude, they get exposed to huge amounts of sunlight, and so the climate is really sensitive to their albedo. And the albedo can be quite variable from, in this picture on a frozen lake, the dark ice to very bright snow. And the albedo determines a number of things about Snowball Earth. How much drawdown of atmospheric CO2 is necessary to glaciate the tropics? What is the critical latitude for the ice albedo instability? What are the surface temperatures on Snowball Earth? How long does the snowball event last? How much volcanic emission is required to warm the climate? What is the thickness of the ice? There was an idea by Chris McKay, who actually got me originally interested in this problem of whether you could have photosynthesis under thin ice for a long period of time, and then whether you could actually have a belt of of water along the equator that wasn't frozen. So we identify these different types of ice. We have from high latitude to low latitude. We have the snow falling on the sea glacier. It's flowing, and depending on how fast it's flowing, at first you'd have, at low latitude, you'd have sea ice. You'd have sublimating and carrying the salt that gets left behind at the surface, so you could have a salt crust on the sea ice. So surface type number 1 is snow, represented by the Antarctic Plateau, albedo 0.83. Bare sea ice is about albedo 0.5. And then if we don't have this happening anywhere on Earth now, but if it would sublimate long enough, bringing salt up to the surface, then you would develop a salt crust. And we estimate you could get a thickness of salt of 1 centimeter after maybe 1,000 years. And Bonnie Light is working on this in laboratory, since we don't have it to look at on Earth, modern Earth. It's actually not the kind of salt crust that we're familiar with, like on the dry lakes. This is halite, sodium chloride, but instead when you form salt by sublimation of ice, you form this hydrated salt, which is hydrohalite. It has 2 waters of hydration. It's not a cubic crystal, it's a monoclinic crystal. Anyway, Bonnie started doing this in the laboratory, and you get this very bright salt. It's actually, we thought it would be a crust. It turns out to be a loose powder that's easily blown away, actually. She now has expanded to this tank that will hold 1 ton of water, and then freezes it and sublimates it, and we've developed a method for measuring albedos in the laboratory, which is not easy, but we think we've got a system that will work pretty well. It involves this dome that provides diffuse illumination. It has 17 coats of white paint on the inside, and anyway, we're making some measurements. And here are some of the first measurements, different types of ice in the tank. The bare subeutectic ice, well, when the crystals start forming, but then when you develop the salt crust, it has a very high albedo. It's actually brighter than snow. Albedo, I should say, as a function of wavelength, above 90%. In fact, if it was halite, it would stay above 90% way out into the infrared, but because of this high waters of hydration, it has these absorption bands of water that show up. Surface type 4, glacier ice, exposed by sublimation, which has never experienced melting. Well, its albedo is determined by the air bubbles that are in the ice. The snow gets compressed into ice, and the ice contains bubbles, and they scatter light. Surface type 5, marine ice, we think that this actually is not important for the Snowball Earth. It probably outcrops only occasionally, and that is based on these modeling results of Jason Goodman showing that the atmospheric hydrological cycle and the oceanic hydrological cycle are actually separated. So there's plenty of marine ice on the bottom, but it doesn't show up, doesn't appear on the surface. So we don't have this kind of beautiful scene to look at on Snowball Earth. Sorry about that. So we took a field trip to look at this bare ice exposed by sublimation, which has never experienced melting. Well, you can get bare glacier ice in the northern hemisphere, even in Washington State, but it's melting. And for this, we have to go to Antarctica, to the transantarctic mountain areas where we went to the Allen Hills near McMurdo Station. And you can see from a satellite picture the bare ice. Here's a diagram of what's going on. There's the reason it's bare is because near the mountains the wind is strong enough to blow the snow away, and also to sublimate some of the ice, about 5 centimeters a year. There's an equilibrium line above which is snow, and below which the snow is sublimating, and then you'll expose old snow, and then young ice, and then old ice, and the ice is flowing up to replace the ice that is lost by ablation. So you have a sequence of across, a transect across that equilibrium line would reveal the sequence. Snow, firn, which is old snow, above a density of 550 kilograms per cubic meter. Young white ice, old blue ice. Yeah. And what these things are, these are meteorites. The reason these areas have been studied is because of the search for meteorites. So they've been well mapped. And in fact, we even came upon a couple of meteorites while we were doing this field work. So our idea was that a 6-kilometer transect in the Antarctic bare ice areas would represent a transect over many degrees of latitude on the Snowball Ocean, from snow, new snow, old snow, young ice, old ice. I went with Peter Mullen and with Rusla Dadic, who, and Rusla had worked in the lab on bubbles in ice. Melanie was our field team leader, and actually she is the one who coined the term originally, coined the term sea glacier, which has now become widely adopted. So we camped on the snow near the ice. It's easier to camp on snow than on ice. And as advertised, it was windy. So we were there in December, and Melanie and another group stayed on through January. And we measured albedo of all these different types of ice, from snow to firn to ice, and collected core samples to measure for the, in the laboratory, to measure the bubble sizes. And these are the sequence: firn, white ice, blue ice. And these are their albedos as a function of wavelength from ultraviolet, visible, near infrared. You can see as we go from snow to firn to white ice to blue ice, the albedo is dropping at all wavelengths. What's also noted on here are the densities. And so as the density increases, the albedo is decreasing. And we thought maybe this could be a surrogate variable. It'd be easier for a glacier model to predict density than to predict bubble sizes in ice. And so we're making use of this for our parameterizations. Well, I did this for Adrian, but maybe I'll jump ahead on this. The way we treat snow and ice, snow is ice grains surrounded by air, glacier ice is air bubbles surrounded by ice, but we have to have all intermediate stages transitioning. And so we got snow, we explained it, it's albedo, and non-spherical particles we represent by equivalent spheres of a particular type. I can see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump over some of this. Lake ice, on the other hand, we have air bubbles surrounded by ice. But what we use as a unifying principle is that they can all be described by the specific surface area, the area of air-ice interfaces per unit mass of ice. Square meters per kilogram is a typical unit. And that's inversely proportional to the grain radius. You can describe snow either way, but for the other ones, it's better to just say specific surface area. So so then we matched the curves using a model, and they matched it where it fails is out at 1.8 microns, and that's because we didn't take into account the variation with depth of the bubble sizes. They get smaller as you go down. Martin and Rusla used X-ray tomography on these ice cores to actually measure the specific surface area. There's also cracks in the ice that contribute to the, and they're caused by temperature cycling. On the Snowball planet, it's probably diurnal cycling rather than seasonal cycling that would be most important. It doesn't matter all that much whether you include the cracks, because the albedo as a function of specific surface area is concave downward. So if you double the specific surface area, you do not double the albedo. For example, even if you have 37% of the specific surface area is due to cracks, then if you take the albedo for bubbles alone and add the cracks, it only increases it by 2%. There is a disagreement between what we get in the albedo model and what is measured from the tomography. And we explain, I think the most likely thing is that it has to do with the asymmetry factor for the non-spherical bubbles. And we've done work on scattering by non-spherical particles that shows that's in the right range. There's also, in this ice, there is an impurity. There's volcanic ash from Antarctic volcanoes. We melted and filtered some of those cores and measured its spectral absorption, and then found out how much we had to add to bring the albedo down. It has effects only in the ultraviolet and the blue part of the spectrum. So by doing this, by explaining these albedos, we're able to know what the albedo would be without the volcanic ash. Instead of, otherwise, we just have to say this is what we measured. So we can provide the albedos of the clean ice, and then we can also say how much it drops as you add this volcanic ash, which would happen over millions of years on the Snowball planet too. Yeah. And then this is our parameterization as a function of density. You can see the albedo integrated over wavelength as a function of density. And then if you transform the density into porosity and take the logarithm, then it comes out to be almost a straight line. So this is what we've done. The density is on the top scale there. And then we've done this for 3 different atmospheric conditions, the cloudy and clear, and then an atmosphere with very little water vapor, like for the Snowball planet. And then what happens to the albedo, it decreases as you add volcanic tephra. So some of these, then we made a table of the albedos of these different ice types. They're, as you can see, well, the left column is for clear sky and the right column is for cloudy sky. Albedo is higher under cloudy sky. Anybody know why that is? This is broadband albedo, integrated over wavelength. For snow, 0.81, 0.89. Yeah, the cloud is acting like a filter. It's made of water too, and so it's absorbing at the same wavelength where snow absorbs. So what it lets through are the wavelengths where snow has a high albedo. So you integrate over wavelength and you get a higher albedo. Okay, there's something to consider about whether ice on the tropical ocean would differ from ice in the Allen Hills. I told Melanie as we were driving in snowmobiles across the Allen Hills, as I was looking out side to side, saying to myself, this is the tropical ocean. So we have this paper in press at JGR. And there are some complications that we also have to consider is the migration rate of bubbles under a temperature gradient because they sublimate at the warm end and deposit at the cold end. Turns out the bottom line is it's unlike, there's a race going on. As the sea glacier is sublimating, the bubbles are migrating downward. And can the bubbles outrun the sublimation front? If so, the ice would become clear and low albedo. But our estimates are that it doesn't. Unlikely that air bubble migration would outrun the advancing sublimation front. There's a similar problem with a salt diffusion in ice. The brine pockets will migrate toward the warm end. We've also done laboratory experiments on that, and we conclude that that migration is too slow to prevent formation of a salt crust on the Snowball Earth. There's also dust. Because even the continents wouldn't have been totally ice covered. There would be desert continents in the tropics, and there would be sources of dust. And the dust atmosphere would become quite a bit dustier, be more like Mars, because on the Earth, the dust has a sink. It can go into the ocean, and it gets trapped in the ocean. But it keeps blowing around and gets caught in the snow. And then it goes into the ice, and the ice sublimates, so it gets back into the atmosphere. So over time, this is going to assist the deglaciation, the lowering of albedo by dust in the ice. This was promoted by Dorian Abbott and Ray Pierre Humbert in this paper that they called Mudball. One other topic that we've addressed I'll just mention it because time is ending. Another possibility besides these hotspots for surface life to survive would be in a nearly enclosed sea where, the risk, suppose you had an area that was out in the ocean, like at the end of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, or the Gulf of Aqaba, maybe it's warm there because it's surrounded by desert, which has a lower albedo than the ocean, the ice-covered ocean. Not that we have the Red Sea, but we'd have something like that. There would have been continental rifting going on in the early 700 million years ago. And maybe you could have a warm enough climate there to support open water, but it would be at risk of invasion of the sea glaciers. So if you have a narrow enough entrance, this is what Adam Campbell is working on, a narrow enough entrance, it slows down the inflow of the sea glaciers so that it sublimates away before you get to the end. So we're looking at that possibility as a refugium. So I think I'll just end it there. I've said all these things. So I'll just let you ask some questions.
Steve, I'll start with the questions. Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. I'll get around to you with the mic. Steve, what were atmospheric conditions like during the Snowball Earth, or what sort of winds could we expect, and could the effect of sastrugi have some sort of effect on the albedo of the ice pack at the surface as well? If winds are strong enough, winds expected to be higher in the Snowball Earth configuration, or perhaps I would think lower, but.
Well, winds are ultimately driven by equator to pole temperature gradient. And the winter temperature difference between the equator and pole is actually quite large from the climate modeling. And so, yeah, particularly in the winter, you could have strong winds. I think that needs to be studied more because you really need to get resolution near the ground to do that. Yeah, and you can read about that in Ray Pierre Humbert's article. Yeah, let me think if I can remember the reasons for why you have this very large temperature gradient. Well, the atmosphere, the transport of heat with latitude, now on the modern Earth it's maybe half by the ocean, half by the atmosphere. You don't have the oceanic heat transport. And the atmospheric heat transport, a lot of that is by latent heat. And so with such a cold climate, cold atmosphere, you can't transport much water vapor. So the ability of the atmosphere to transport heat is greatly reduced. So that's probably a large part of the reason for why you end up with this large temperature gradient. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the majority of geologists don't believe in a snowball Earth.
Mm-hmm.
What's their arguments against it, and why do you disagree?
Well, I don't know all of this, but I think one of the major things is they're looking at glacial, well, there's several things, but one is they're looking at glacial deposits and they're seeing, look, they're seeing evidence of active erosion. Well, now glaciers that are frozen to the bed don't erode. And so they're seeing evidence of, throughout the snowball event, they're seeing evidence of active glaciation, implying that the glaciers were warm. Well, there is, even under the Antarctic ice sheet now, there are many places where the temperature, because the ice is thick enough, even though the surface is minus 50 or minus 60, it's at the melting temperature at the bed. If the ice is thick enough, you do have wet-based glaciers. The other thing is that these sea glaciers can erode on the continental shelf. So some of these glacial deposits maybe were not caused by land-based glaciers. They may have been caused by sea glaciers coming onto shallow continental shelves that were thinner than the ice and eroding the continental shelf and leaving these deposits.
Hi, to your left. Hi. So I'm thinking about extrasolar planets, and I'm wondering what we might see someday if you have a sense of within the habitable zone, how constrained does like Earth's orbit around the sun and the brightness of the sun have to be to get this kind of situation? And might we see it in other solar systems, or is it just such a Goldilocks kind of thing that it's very unlikely?
Well, yeah, Goldilocks would not be happy on Snowball Earth. So
Maybe the bears are polar bears.
yeah, I think there's a. Oh, gee, I'd have to think about that a bit, but I don't think it's a narrow range that that is accessible to Snowball because, well, I guess, well, really what I suppose you want to ask is what planet would be in the range where you could both go in and out of it, not be locked in it for forever, yeah. Yeah, I don't think it matters so much what the distance is from the sun. I mean, see, if we didn't have carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, Andy Lasis has pointed this out in a recent publication, that we would be in a snowball right now. Because water vapor, just even though it's the major greenhouse gas, it follows carbon dioxide because it's a response. It's not a driver of climate. Whereas if you take away the carbon dioxide, you would have a snowball planet. So it really depends on what the atmospheric gases are, whether you do or don't have a snowball. Venus has, of course, a higher albedo than the Earth, and the other surface is quite a bit warmer because of its huge greenhouse effect.
I've got a question here. I didn't quite understand early in the talk about the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere on the ice. Is that what you said?
Yeah. What I'm saying is that CO2 would not be removed during the snowball. And so it would build up in the atmosphere. There's no way to remove it. I mean, nowadays, CO2 dissolves in rainwater and it comes out, and then the CO2 reacts with rocks. It's taken up by photosynthesis. You don't have any photosynthesis going on. You don't have, or very little, and you don't, and so you're not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It does get removed after the ice melts.
Well, by exposure to the rock. So I thought you were suggesting that it actually.
No, that's right. The carbonate got deposited immediately on top of these glacial deposits. That's because, presumably, nothing much was happening in the ocean during these millions of years.
Well, how do you make a carbonate on top of ice?
Not on top of ice, on top of the glacial deposits.
Oh, I see.
On top of the rocks, the moraines, the debris. So you're making all this stuff, and then the ice melts, and then in the ocean, then you get So then you get these carbonate deposits on top of, well, just on the ocean floor, which happens to be in some places shallow ocean that is glacial deposits. Yeah.
Steve, we have a question from online. Do you ever encounter CO2 ice at high latitudes where temperatures sometimes get extremely low?
Okay, I didn't bring a graph to remind myself of the vapor pressure of CO2 as a function of temperature. You're not, okay, we got an answer to that, no. There's the right, it would be colder, and also, well, of course, there are two things going on. It's as the CO2 builds up to where it might be able to precipitate, then it's also getting warmer. If CO2 could condense out, then it would, it would prevent this way of getting out of the snowball, because it would you remove the greenhouse effect. I think, I don't know, maybe at the, a fairly high CO2 level at the winter pole, and then it would come off again in the spring. I'm just sorry, I don't remember. I did work out the numbers on that. I don't actually remember the answer. But yeah, it's, and I think Ray Pierre Humbert addresses that in his review article. I think the conclusion was that certainly it's not going to prevent us from getting out of the snowball. There's not that much deposit, but there maybe could be some temporarily in the wintertime at the pole.
I'm clear on how it might end with volcanic CO2 being emitted over time, accumulating, and then would come the hothouse and the melt. What I'm not clear on, though, I just didn't get it. How snowball could begin and the instabilities that are involved.
Okay, well, I can tell you one story, but unfortunately it's been discredited. So, it could have happened. Okay, so. And Dan Schrag thought there was isotopic evidence for it too in the carbon isotopes. Well, so CO2, there's this geological cycle that sort of regulates CO2 and climate operating on a 1,000,000-year time scale, approximately, or 500,000 years. So if the climate gets warm, CO2 gets removed more rapidly because the reaction rates of the rock weathering goes faster. Also, as you warm the climate, you melt away continental glaciation, you expose more rocks to weathering. And then, as you cool the climate, you cover them up, so you slow down the weathering so CO2 can build up, because there's always this volcanic source. So there's this negative feedback that is regulating the climate. It's not fast enough to do anything about what we're doing now for global warming, not even fast enough to change the ice age cycles. It just can't keep up with the CO2 ups and downs during the ice ages. But it was, but it is important on 1,000,000-year timescales. Now, if methane was, you've got sources of methane that, there are these methane hydrates under pressure, and with tectonic changes, maybe some of these methane reservoirs would come up to low enough pressure that they would bubble up into the atmosphere. And this could happen gradually, and methane is a greenhouse gas, and so this regulation of temperature, because of the higher temperature, it would take carbon dioxide out. So the climate could have been maybe dependent on methane then as its greenhouse gas, having removed the CO2. But then this reservoir suddenly runs out of methane. There's no more source of methane. Methane lifetime maybe is short enough that it gets destroyed faster than CO2 can recover, and then that could lead into a snowball. I think the criticism of that, also in Pierre Humbert's review, is that the lifetime of methane, although it's short on the modern Earth, it would have been longer in a high methane atmosphere. I can't remember the details of that, but that was one idea for how we might have. I think they actually used the word addiction. The climate might have become addicted to methane for its greenhouse gas.
I'm intrigued by this thought of the glacier moving from the poles towards the equator. And I'm thinking several of the outer solar system's larger moons are probably large layers of ice over an ocean that's probably maintained by tidal friction.
Yes.
Is it likely that those are also transporting ice from the poles towards the equator?
Yeah. Yeah, if you've got a temperature, that's right. If the temperature is different, if it's warmer at the surface temperature than at the pole, then then that should happen. Yeah, I don't. You have to work out what the rates would be. Ice. The trouble is that ice, the flow of ice requires requires breaking and reforming hydrogen bonds, and so there's this activation energy that appears in the flow law of ice. And as I recall, something like 50 kilojoules per mole, which is what you get. I mean, you get that experimentally, but it turns out to be essentially 2 hydrogen bonds have to be broken to reorient a water molecule. And so when you go to low temperatures, the flow gets extremely slow. So what you might have then is you'd have this upper, I'm just speculating now, maybe this upper part of ice of the surface, like on Europa, it would be very cold and wouldn't flow because it's just too cold to flow. And then down below, it would just be sitting on this ice that might flow, subsurface. Yeah.
Interesting.
Steve, we have here a special thank you gift, which is actually the first of a new generation of whispering robots. I think they're whispering the Drake equation to each other or something like that. Hopefully it'll find a nice place back in your office or something like that. Please join me in thanking Steve for his great talk.